the next speaker is Dr. David Cavazos. He is an associate professor of management at James Madison University. His research interests include corporate reputation, regulation, and new venture creation. His areas of expertise include strategic management projects, management, and statistics. Okay.
Yay. Well, hi, everybody. So my presentation today, in a way, complements all the previous presentations, although I'm going to focus specifically on higher education. But the theme there is about kind of how how analytics is kind of past higher education, and we're trying to catch up. And those who have specific skill sets are thriving in this environment. And part of my presentation, also, I'll give you an example of some of my current research that kind of follows the steps that Dr. Sharma talked about. So I'll give you an example of a research project and how I use data analytics or statistics and what story the outcomes are telling. So first I'm going to talk about, well, what exactly do I mean by higher education careers? And essentially, I mean PhDs, professors. And then I'm going to talk about why analytics is becoming important in higher education. And then should you pursue a higher education degree, a master's degree, PhD, what are some career possibilities? And then finally, I'll give you an example of a typical project that a PhD at a university will do. So a little background about myself. So I'm a business school professor. I teach strategic management, project management, statistics. And then many would wonder, well, why or how is a business school professor also a data analytics person? Well, my background's in economics. I took a ton of math and computer science. My master's is in public finance. Again, ton of statistics. My PhD is in corporate strategy within business administration. Again, I took a ton of statistics. And during that time, I thought, oh, I just know a lot about statistics. All of my research is quantitative throughout my entire career. And it wasn't until recently that suddenly I realized, oh, yeah, I kind of am a data analytics person because I know a ton about statistics. So that kind of goes back to my brother's presentation about the terminology changes over time, but the core competencies required to be proficient in this field, those don't change, right? It's just what we call them change. I mean, I just realized I did a logistic regression for a project, and it turns out, oh, well, that's really machine learning now. Oh, okay. So again, the fundamentals really do matter, and taking statistics is always important if you want to pursue this field. So in terms of higher education careers, I'm focusing on faculty careers because professors, we teach, but we also have to conduct research. And the challenge we're facing is that research is becoming really, really quantitative because, as our first presenter said, data is everywhere now. And if the data isn't available, there are ways to get it, right? So journals require, for the most part, quantitative research, very sound quantitative research. And as a result, faculty have to be highly trained in quantitative methods. And the challenge is we tend not to be. I think back on my PhD program, which is considered somewhat quantitative, the requirements for doctoral students was to take basically 3 research methods classes. That's it. I took 9 because I was insane. But it's paid huge dividends. And of course, I've continued to learn more after that. And I sometimes reflect, well, if I had taken the bare minimum, what most people took, I mean, would I be able to conduct the quantitative research that I'm doing now? Would I be able to help doctoral students the way I'm helping them now with their quantitative projects? The answer is probably no. So that goes back to a serious gap we have, right, in the reality of society and the need for a particular skill set, and then the lack of training in that particular skill set, which is it's somewhat concerning, right? But universities are adjusting, but ultimately it still remains up to the student. So those of you who are pursuing graduate studies and are interested in analytics, I would encourage you take as many quantitative classes as possible, even if they're not required, and also pursue individual learning to the best of your ability, because the more you know, the better, but of course also the greater your ability to learn more, the better, right? Because we're constantly learning and we have to constantly expand what we know. So as a result, if one pursues that mindset in higher education, well, those faculty members tend to flourish. For example, I've done a lot of research with colleagues that don't know anything about statistics, so they need me to be on their research project so I could do the quantitative part of it. And plus, I've been able to spearhead my own research because I could do the writing and the research. So of course, it helps in many ways to have that solid foundation. And of course, it helps if one decides to pursue consulting. But where we see analytics and these kind of deficiencies, we see them both at the training stage and at the applied stage. So in the training stage, as many of you are master's students, so whether it's an MBA or a Master of Science, such programs tend to kind of shortchange students as far as how well they train them in analytics fields. Unless, of course, the student specifically studies business analytics, right? In that case, the whole program is tailored towards that. But if somebody pursues an MBA in finance, it's up to that student to decide, well, if I'm interested in analytics, I should probably minor in analytics, or I should take a ton of electives in analytics, right? Nobody is going to tell you to do that, but you must. In doctoral programs is the same thing. As I mentioned, journals, research has become so highly quantitative, so data-based, that if you're not proficient in data collection, cleaning, analysis, interpretation, you will not have a successful career as a college professor, amazingly. And people don't usually think that, right? They think we teach, but it's a great deal of applied quantitative research. So that takes me to the applied stage. Whether you work in some sort of administrative capacity at a university, managing enrollment, HR, strategic planning, project management, all of those fields require some knowledge of analytics. They may not require expert knowledge, but they do require that you're proficient in analyzing and visualizing data. And of course, as I mentioned, if you're a university faculty, to thrive and have a successful career as a professor, you have to be quantitative based. So anyhow, so why is that? Well, university professors, well, we have to plan, develop, and design our research. And it's almost always quantitative, peer-reviewed research. Peer-reviewed journals love to say that they welcome qualitative research as well, but they really don't, at least not in business administration. They still gravitate towards quantitative research, and the more interesting the data and the analysis, the better. So we have to be proficient in collecting, coding, and analyzing this data for projects, but we also have to be able to interpret these findings. And more importantly, we have to be able to decide what questions to ask given the data. So I was talking before the meeting with Ryan on having a bachelor's degree in economics and how that helps us kind of have a big picture of how the moving parts of things. That sort of perspective tends to help when you're putting together research questions, when you're looking at large data sets and you're wondering, where do I start? How do I start looking at trends in this data? How do I start mining this data? And then of course you get into the specific techniques that you might use to mine that data. And there's numerous techniques. So as an example, I've worked with a great deal of students in all of these fields, and of course colleagues as well. So public health, of course, is a hugely salient field right now, right? As we see in the news every day. Public health faculty the world essentially conduct research dealing with infection rates, immunity rates, effectiveness of vaccines. They examine individual behavior and how this behavior leads to certain health conditions or how it might help certain health conditions. So to answer all those questions that are so important to society, they need to have that data analytics / statistics in their tool set. Psychology research. Psychology deals with individual behavior and also group behavior to an extent. Psychology faculty have to be well equipped with developing models that effectively predict human behavior given certain inputs. There's this famous study I recall that was looking at norms, and it was actually a colleague of mine from University of New Mexico that developed this paper, which is really, really cool, where he was looking at public parks. And he was studying norms where, okay, if a public park is really, really clean, what's the likelihood that someone will litter if it's really, really clean? And of course, the likelihood is very low because that person, even if they have the tendency to litter, they'll recognize that, well, nobody here litters, so I better not. Whereas if somebody goes to a public park and there's trash everywhere, chances are more people will just continue to throw trash out. It seems like a very straightforward question, but then the challenge is, well, how do you actually create a statistical model to predict that, right? Which he was able to do. So again, some of these, or many of these research projects, they lend themselves to public policy. Economics research, of course, we see all kinds of forecasting research about consumer behavior, about GDP, about unemployment, right? Using large data sets, largely time series, right? Because economics researchers look at trends over time. They look at phenomena over time with the purpose of predicting the directionality of future phenomena. So again, really large data sets using a lot of linear forecasting methods. And then business research is kind of a blend of everything. So again, I'm a business faculty a professor, and I have been for the bulk of my career. Business research goes from predicting consumer behavior to trying to predict corporate performance, corporate financial performance, or even corporate social performance, predicting employment patterns among individuals. We try to predict what motivates individuals or what discourages individuals. There's even business research on bullying now. And of course, a great deal of business research on social issues, such as social responsibility, gender equality, racial equality, and the role of organizations in those social issues. As a result, business scholars have to be well versed in statistics to provide accurate answers to these really, really difficult questions. So again, the role of analytics, it goes beyond being an analytics professional, right? It's rooted into academia. So assuming one has the willingness to enter a PhD program, there's numerous possibilities. I mean, research possibilities. I mean, the CDC hires a great deal of PhDs. Bethesda, Maryland, where the National Institute of Health is located, they have the most PhDs per capita of any place in the country, because these are research positions. And these research positions aren't just in government organizations, but also in private organizations. So the people behind the scenes doing a lot of the coding and the modeling, many of these people are data scientists. They have PhDs and they have proficiencies in statistics and statistical coding and data management. They may not be the people that present the data or interact with executives, but they're the ones who developed the data analysis strategies. So there's a huge array of research positions that one with a PhD and a competency in analytics could achieve, and they're very high paying, and yeah, and they're very satisfying positions. Full-time university faculty, that's what I am. I'm a little biased towards that career because it allows a great deal of flexibility, in particular if you're a great researcher. So if you're a great researcher, you get tenured. If you get tenure, you have freedom to pursue any research you're interested in. And mine does tend to be quantitative research. Of course, consulting opportunities. A lot of organizations that don't have their own analytics departments or professionals, they contract out to analytics consultants. So as a result, there's a huge demand for data analytics consultants out there. So if one has a PhD in a quantitative field or in a business field, and they have a competency in analytics, one could build a very, very prolific career in data analytics consulting. And finally, new ventures. So a lot of what we study in business schools include under what conditions does an economy generate new venture growth, new venture creation. Entrepreneurs have to have an understanding of how to interpret and make sense of data so that they could be better prepared to create new ventures in circumstances that most benefits their venture. And that, again, requires data proficiency. So those are some of the career possibilities. So now the next slide, I'm shifting over to the last section of my presentation to an example of a research project. To give you a little bit of background on this before, because I'm diving straight into the hypotheses, because otherwise it would take forever just to describe everything about this research. But in short, this research explores how corporate reputation impacts corporate behavior when something goes wrong, and also government behavior when they see that that corporation did something wrong. And I'm looking at the automobile industry. So this research, it's about 16,000 observations in the automobile industry that looks at product defects. So it's looking at vehicle safety. And I'm trying to predict behavior based on how good a reputation or how bad a reputation a company has for product safety, right? So you could imagine, okay, if a company has a great reputation for product safety, they're going to respond a certain way when there's a product defect. And that might be different than how a company has a poor product safety reputation has when a similar thing happens. So think about if a car has a defect that causes the hood to pop up while you're driving. The idea is companies with different reputations for safety are going to respond differently to that same event. And in addition, I'm trying to predict whether the government treats companies different, whether they're preferential towards companies that have a solid reputation versus companies that have a poor reputation, given the same damaging event. So again, this research deals with the automobile industry. And again, so I'm trying to be predictive here about, okay, if a company works on their reputation, will it change their own culture about how they respond to things? But also, will it change how stakeholders see them, right? So again, so this is my research example. So looking at the data, looking at the literature that I've studied on corporate reputation and strategy, I developed 3 hypotheses. So this stage, if you think about this stage of the data analysis or analytics kind of approaches, you're trying to predict what the data may look like, right? What would be some of the outcomes if we examine the data? So I had 3 general outcomes about this data. I thought, okay, high reputation firms are probably more likely to be proactive, right? It makes sense, right? If you have a firm that's really, really known for being safe and having safe products, if something goes wrong, they're going to jump on it, right? They're going to move really fast. They're more likely to implement a response, but they're also going to be faster, right? They're going to take care of it really, really fast. At the same time, high reputation firms, because they're known for having a certain standard of performance, they're actually protected a little bit from the government because they have this expectation that no, they'll take care of it. So chances are the government might be a little bit more lax with high reputation firms than they would be with a company that's known for having problems all the time. So these are the hypotheses. Now, once you generate these hypotheses, that's again based on what you think the data is going to do, then you have to figure out how to measure things, right? So I had to develop measures for reputation. And this goes back, okay, so when you're a professor, you have to read the literature. So reputation is performance along a certain attribute, right? So yeah, it's a reputation for something. So notice I'm measuring reputation for safety. But it's also relative, right? Because when a company has a high reputation, that means that their reputation is better than that of other companies. So it has to be a relative measure as well. So you have to know enough about data to be able to develop, and mathematics essentially, to be able to develop an effective measure of something that measures a company's reputation for something. And of course, I did that in this paper. And I won't get into it because it's a long story and I don't want to go over an hour, but it's a ratio measure, to short. So the empirical context of this, again, I was looking at government recalls and inspections. And I was looking at cases where the government orders a company to recall a vehicle versus when companies actually do it voluntarily. So to put it into context, when there's a vehicle defect, the company could actually attend to it themselves. say that there's consumer complaints that something's going on with the wipers or any part of the vehicle. They issue a complaint, and a company could be really proactive and jump on it and fix it, or they could ignore it and wait until the government makes them do it. So that's what I'm looking at. When does the government make you do it versus when do you just do it, right? When you see it's a problem. So that's my context. And here's the data. So notice it's 15 companies, 1966 to 2012. My N is 17,847. So I'm looking at 17,847 instances of a recall. So that's when we get into the data cleaning part of it. So from this data, I developed several variables, right? And as you guys know, as you pursue your studies in statistics, there's your independent variable and then there's your dependent variables. And then I have control variables. What control variables are, they're factors that may predict your independent variable that you want to account for because you're trying to predict something else, right? So these are other factors that would predict companies being super proactive, right? So we would like to think, for instance, if a recall is really, really bad, so like if the car explodes, right, we would assume that if we're predicting proactivity, that would make companies be pretty proactive if they know that their product is killing people, right? Or if it's a huge recall, right, we might expect, okay, that's going to impact how quickly or whether they're proactive about it. So again, these are all factors that would predict proactivity outside of my key factors. So my factor of interest is reputation for quality. So again, so this goes back into you have to know how to design a data, right? You have to know how to organize it. So I looked at my variable of interest and the outcomes, but I also had to consider what other variables of interest would lead to these outcomes. So I had to collect data on all of this as well. I had to code it. So again, that's where analytics comes in. So the magic happens, and you decide on methods. And in short, you have to know enough about data probability distributions to decide what methods to use. So I use two different kinds of regressions. I use the binomial logistic regression, which is suitable when you're predicting something that has two possible outcomes. And then I used a negative binomial regression, which is more appropriate when you have counts and mostly zeros. So again, this goes back to knowledge of statistics, right? You have to know enough about probability distributions to decide what method you have to use. So again, this goes back to this idea of foundational knowledge, right? Knowing the fundamentals, knowing probability distributions, knowing the difference between, say, a data set that includes yes, no responses, right? That would be binomial, that's two responses, or a data set that maybe has event attendance per hour, right? How many people are showing up to an event every hour? That's a count, right? That would be a different type of distribution versus a variable that measures something. Say you're measuring velocity, say you're measuring how long does it take for a patient to recover if they're given a certain medication, right? These are measurements. That's a other type of distribution, which is more like a normal distribution, which we know of. So again, it's really important to have this background. So once I applied the methods, what did I find? So this looks like a whole lot of numbers, right? Which it is. And I have my firm reputation for quality variable down here. So this is the variable of interest. Now notice there's a positive number here, 4.74, and it's significant. We're looking at for values less than 0.05 here. So it's positive. So what this suggests is firms with a higher reputation for quality, they are more likely to be proactive, which that's good news. But if we look closely in this, there's some amusing bad news too. Notice the severity of defect. Recall I was controlling for that because that's something that, I would like to think that the more severe a defect is, the more proactive companies would be. But look what happened. This is negative. So that means they're less likely to be proactive. And it is significant. So that's pretty disturbing when you think about it, that the more severe a defect, the less likely a company is going to be proactive about it. Also, the number of units impacted. That means the more vehicles are impacted by a defect, the less likely firms will be proactive. And then the final bit of bad news before I move on to the next slide, which is more optimistic, the more, this is negative as well, consumer complaints. And it's significant. The more consumer complaints a company gets about their product or their vehicle in this case, the less likely they are to be proactive. So the automobile industry does not look good here, does it? But here's the next slide. This takes into account how fast firms will respond. And again, firms with a higher reputation will be faster. But here's the good news that goes a little bit beyond the bad news from that last slide. Notice our severity defect variable is positive. So again, it means, okay, maybe they won't be as proactive as far as getting in front of the government, but at least once they know, once the government tells them to fix it, at least they'll be faster, right? So at least there's that. Also, consumer complaints, they'll also be faster. So there's that at least, right? So they'll be faster, but not necessarily proactive. And then finally, the government. Now this is really interesting. So this does find that the higher the reputation for quality a firm has, the less likely the government is to punish them for the same defect that a lower reputation firm would get. So this does show that there is some preferential treatment, whether it's knowingly or not, that there is a bias that if a company is perceived as being high reputation for quality, they're less likely to be punished than if a firm has a lower reputation for quality. So it shows that there is a government bias. So again, great illustration of the importance of analytics to tell a story, right? Because I think you guys could see this seemingly abstract presentation of numbers here that's a result of 3 regressions, and there's 2 different regressions here. They're telling a story, which means the data is telling a story here. So this is a great example of the kind of research that PhDs in academic institutions that we have to do. So again, highly, highly quantitative. So here's the story. Reputation is a signal, right? It's a signal that influences firm operations. And it's also a resource that protects companies. So with this story, if I was reporting this to a CEO of General Motors, I would tell them, work on your reputation for safety, because when something does go wrong, you're less likely to be punished, right? Which isn't quite the story we want to say, right? We like to think that the government would be fair in how they punish firms, but there is a bias, right? So if I was a consultant for McKinsey and I did all this data, I would tell them, work on your reputation, right? Create the perception that you're very safe, or actually become very safe, right? So when something goes wrong, you're less likely to be punished. So again, this is a great example of data analytics kind of in action. So at this point, I could take questions regarding academia, but also about analytics in general, because again, I've been doing quantitative research since 2005, so it's kind of a long time. So I'm open to questions from you guys. Anything is welcome.
Thank you.
Sure.
Are there any questions? Well, I have a question while I have you here. You said something very valuable about becoming a good analyst. Would you say that taking the right classes way more than, say, if you were at a company where you're getting proper training in analysis, or which one do you think is more?
That's a great.
I would think taking those classes, like that foundation to take the courses.
Yeah, the courses,
you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, the courses give you the foundation to be able to learn more when you're done, right?
Right.
So ideally, your formal education, right, at universities, they give you that basis, so that when you get out, you could actually learn on the job. Because yeah, I mean, most of my learning has taken place outside. Now that I'm done, it's taken place after graduate school. So after I finished the PhD, I've actually learned more about stats than while I was in the PhD, even though I took a ton of stats, because you have to do that, right? Because methods change, and there's just no way you can learn every possible method, every possible platform in school. I mean, you're going to learn the basics, and from there you have to build out. So on-the-job training is huge, and learning new methods as you go. That's hugely important. You can't settle on the things you're used to doing. right? Because if I did, I would just be
Right,
doing 4 methods because I tend to do 4 or 5
right,
different
right,
methods
right,
for a reason. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
right.
that's huge, right? We gotta keep spiraling out, right? Keep learning things.
But would you say that I think, having known you as a colleague, I think it's key that you say you're a researcher because you have the ability to look things up,
Right, and that's huge,
right?
right? Yeah, because
It's
if
a
we don't
big deal.
yeah, if you don't know
Yeah,
something, you should be able to learn it, right? And learn it
right.
properly. Because there's no way we're gonna know everything. Yeah, and we've talked about this, and this is huge, and this is why,
Yeah,
it's a great, you're running a
it's
great
a
company,
big,
there's a little
it's a
plug.
big deal. Yeah,
Yeah, we gotta
it's a
keep
big
learning.
deal.
Yeah, definitely.
Are there any questions in the audience?
Hey, Ryan.
Hey, David. Thank you for the wonderful presentation, by the way. My question, because you talked a lot about quantitative analysis for the most part.
Mhm.
When it comes to what like qualitative analysis, because not all data is quantitative,
That's right. That's right.
and a good chunk of it can't be translated from qualitative to quantitative, just because of the nature of the data.
Right.
Do you think there's still a place for trying to do that type of analysis?
Oh yeah, there's a huge place for it, and in business it is growing. There's actually software that looks at text patterns over time. Um, so it is really important. And say in my data in this project, I had to do some qualitative because when I was coding this data, and this is a great example of cleaning the data and preparing it for analysis. Some of this data was from the government, and they had a whole big cell where they described the defect, right? So I had to look for patterns and, well, how does the government describe defects so I could code them as either being severe, moderate, or not severe, right? Because some of the defects were basically windshield wiper flies off while in use. Others were car explodes unexpectedly when ignition not turned on, right? So those are two one will cause a house fire and potentially kill people. The other is just an annoyance. So I actually had to look at the patterns of how do they describe this, and I actually ended up using, this goes back to Robert's presentation on how important Excel is. I was able to get Excel to identify the words fire, crash, injury, and death, because those are the 4 terms that they tended to use for the really bad ones. And Excel was able to make it a 1 if it had any one of those 4 words, or a 0 if it had none of those 4 words. So that was a little bit of qualitative there, right? Because sometimes you do have to translate qualitative data to quantitative. You have to quantify it. But other times, if it's more complex, and I think this gets more to your point, say you're looking at, I don't know, reports to shareholders by a company, right? And you want to look at patterns of language that are used in these reports to shareholders, these letters to shareholders.
Yeah.
There's actually software that looks at patterns of words and the order of how words are used. So there's a huge field for qualitative research. And even just experiential based research, where you spend time in a company, you do an ethnography where you spend time observing and talking to people and interviewing. That's another type of qualitative research that's extremely valuable.
Okay. Do you think that there, like when it comes to like on the academic side, do you think there's more of an emphasis on the qualitative or less of an emphasis?
It depends on the field. In business, it's mostly quantitative, but it is starting to move towards qualitative, because I think part of that is where research is going. Just in the last decade, there's been much more of a push to analyze social issues in business. So it's just, you're not looking at just stock prices and firm performance and things like that. You're looking at things like reputation, or you're looking at social responsibility. You're looking at, to what extent to organizations do companies contribute to inequality in society? So those types of questions require qualitative work, right? They require data that goes beyond just numbers, right? You have to talk with people in communities. So it's moving there, but then there are other, sociology is there already. Psychology has been there for a while. So it has like poli-sci. Finance has a ways to go, and so does econ, but they're also getting there.
Yeah. Okay.
Are there any other questions? Well, Dr. Cavazos, will you be at the social networking today or tomorrow?
A little today and tomorrow.
tomorrow. Okay, good. So I highly recommend that people take the time to talk to him, talk to Dr. Cavazos and ask questions, you know? Are there any other questions here?
This is Marilyn. This isn't really a research in the way of like psychology, but my sister is a professor of English. So she's got a PhD in English. She teaches literature and book history, and she's doing a project where she's tracking literary agents of a magazine from 1902, their movement through time. So I am so proud of myself because I taught her how to set her data up in a way that it can be.
Oh, that's such a great illustration of even in literature, right? You've got to know data, right? And sounds like a fascinating study. I love literature as well. And yeah, I mean, that's awesome that you kind of helped set that up. It's also indicative that even in English, you have to know it, but that there's a deficiency, right? That perhaps doctoral programs in literature should focus a little more on research methods. But that's a great example.
My internet connection isn't great. Sorry.
Nope.
We set up some pivot tables. So now she knows how to use pivot tables, which is a big step for an English professor. Okay?
It is, and that's my point about, again, literature. Even if you're an English professor, there's going to be some quantitative, some data science concepts applied, right? It might not be to the extent that if you were a quantitative finance researcher, but it's there, right? So it's very important in all fields, essentially. If you're a researcher, whether it's literature or engineering or finance, you know, to different degrees, but it's there, right? Analytics is there. So yeah, that's a great.
She's on her way to being a data scientist.
All right, yeah, very good. I like that example.
Okay, if there are no other questions, are there any other questions?
I just have a
Dr.
quick
Cavazos?
question. Just a very quick question. I was just wondering, Mr. Cavazos, that's how you say it, if you're open to info sesh whenever, or if you do those.
Yeah, I'm open. I have not done those, but I'm open to that. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I just would like to know. Thank you.
That's great. I forgot what it's called. Information interviews, right?
Yeah.
Yes. I highly recommend it. I did one, and you get a lot of information from it. So yes.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. Are there any other questions? Let's see. It's okay. We have a 45-minute break. If there are no other questions, we could make it a 50-minute break and come back at 3 o'clock. 3 o'clock will be the next, try to come back like 5 minutes early. And thank you, Dr. Cavazos. That was a really good talk. Thank you very much for taking the time to put that together. And I thought it was there was a lot of good gems in there. And okay, I will see you guys at 3.